It could arguably be said that every nation has a tone. Every country has an atmosphere. Every collective imagination of a people located in a place has an energy. What is the energy of South Africa? One, in looking deeper, could see the intersecting pathways of a settler colonial country that has ancestors who drowned and grieved in the blood of colonialism and emerged as a vibrant culture of dance, electronic groove, and agony in the form of art and humor. South Africa is one of those places that are walking juxtapositions of how freedom in itself as an idea might be the biggest contradiction that we've been chasing as a species. And I think it's conversations like these that often get me reflecting on the importance of certain figures in the history of the country. There are people who have been very aware of the social fabric that they are intertwined in. People who have been very centered, deliberate, and intentional about the strings that they've pulled, because they've understood how to a larger extent and degree design the very fabric in and of itself in ways that could do the best it can for them on a personal capacity, and thus could maybe resonate on some level to impacting black people in the country in ways that open doors for the transition of township experience into the capitalist marketplace, not so much as fodder of slavery and subjection, but in a place that puts the people in a position to actually have their voice heard, which creates this interesting place of limbo, where for the first time we have people directly speaking to people like them. And even though things are sold in the process to inebriate that message in a hailstorm of product placement, it does something. It opens up a door where the product placement cannot escape the simultaneous politics that comes with it. The politics that reminds us that our situation is far from ideal. In matter of fact, it is downright still oppressive. And that now that apartheid, or apartheid, for those who groove with that pronunciation, has privatized itself, it probably is worse, because the implicit nature of it deems it invisible and makes those who are still subject to it invisible to the rest of the world. I want to talk about a figure who stands in the middle of two of South Africa's most influential sectors. On one hand, we have the story of icons and revolutionaries that have emerged to fight for the country's political destiny in the form of the politics, with the movement of the ANC and the DA and now the EFF being partisan locations of how people translate this pain in the form of policy and branding and aesthetics. And then on the other side, you have art. How South Africans have tried to take the experience of living in this country and alchemize it into some kind of story, living story, that has the breadth to allow further generations to be imparted with the kind of wealth that might be unlocked in ages to come, but is still there, like a seed, just waiting to be opened with the right kind of political consciousness. Sipho Sithole, born in Durban, Umlazi, is this figure. He's a figure who is in the middle of a moral story, where many view his proximity to politics as an easy gateway to labeling him as a villain. And the fact that he has occupied a seat in some of South Africa's most powerful rooms makes us feel that he's one of those shadowy people who seem to be in this elite field of names that quote-unquote rule the country. And yet, he speaks almost as one of us. He has this indelible charm that lends itself to us. And many of us have come to trust him because his branding and the kind of people he has implored to extend the message he believes in have been, to the most part, people of an Afrocentric ilk. Thandi Samazwai, Zulu Boy, Pro Kid, Squatter Cam, fuck, even Zaka. For the most part, Sipho Sithole looks for a certain kind of artist. Indeed, he has said it is the message that attracts him to artistry. He, not being formally trained in music, is organically skilled just through life in the sheer capacity of knowing how to identify how pain sounds in the form of a melody and how that pain can be translated into some semblance of faith in the future possibility. I, as a cultural analyst and content creator, have never seen a single video that attempts to go into Sipho Sithole in a way that is somewhat beyond the famous figure. The lazy capitalist story of black excellence and Ujobe, who kind of sits in this starry place of occupying the artistic endeavors of artists, yet at the very same time still being highly embroiled in the politics of it all, is a bit of an incomplete argument. I mean, no argument can ever be done. But I want to attempt to go into the possible depth of his story. I don't know the man, but this is an exegesis. In other words, it's an attempt to dissect the makings of Sipho Sithole as an observer and an active student like myself watches and learns. My name is Vijay, the brother from the Ancient Mother. This is the story of Sipho Sithole. Tune in with me. Having had been one of the people who has had the opportunity to go from apartheid South Africa into the open winds of the global world through studying in America and later in the UK, these chances, these opportunities given to many by some the stroke of exile, in how it politically dislocated people, how in that network there were South Africans abroad who were doing work that could allow for gateways of young South Africans, particularly black South Africans, to swarm in and give the world a sense of what was going on, but also walk away with an important sense of globalism. And by globalism I mean breaching this very limited capacity that apartheid deliberately wanted them to have, where you are locked in the four corners of an RDP mindset and you find yourself emerging into a world that tells you you are the world in itself. And the world is, I don't know, your oyster or your bunny chow or whatever. And as a result, Sipho Sithole is one of these people, the recipient of a moment in South Africa that allowed curious young black minds like him to milk up the culture of black America with its civil rights hostility, with the emergence of movements like funk, jazz, and hip-hop, to come back to a country in a position where all that education allows for you to now be part of a new black elite. What are the new black elite? Capitalistically speaking, they are the ones that whiteness allows in the gate to present the face of change. And they become, of their own will, as effective as they're willing to be. There are many who are not worth the mention because they've used that door to shut that door for many like themselves. But I think in somebody like Sipho Sithole, we see what it's possibly like to have the heart of the streets, but to be in a position that is literally in the cave of whiteness itself. Or if you consider the metaphor, in the brilliance and in the light of it. Because whiteness is supposedly all things bright and shiny. To be a Zuluni in itself, with the palaces right before you, the shiny marble floors, and the offices of names that feel European in tone, opening themselves up to you because you are the trusted, clever black. And I think it is this trusted cleverness that Sipho Sithole consciously used echoing a kind of Biko-esque understanding that says we've got to kind of fight the system from within. And if we are going to engage with this monster in its own belly, we're going to have to understand how to live in its temperature. And I think in the temperature of being part of the industries of transportation, telecommunications, politics as a whole in its policy planning, he found an opening in music that when looking at his resume could give him the needed mental break to focus on things which had more of a real, true-to-life, direct impact. And I think it's this opportunity that came in the form of being part of head of South Africa's oldest formalized record label, in a place where he saw the gaps and was able to literally transform its policies, thereby shifting the label to something which was more aware of its own cultural milieu. We thus enter the era of Sithole as everybody else in the light of fame knows him. A black man who is using the opportunity he has to pull the plugs for artists he felt really deserve it, because they're not easily falling into what capitalism wants them to say, which is, here, have this, take the opportunity to walk away from it and be fine. But they are also trying, an emphasis on trying, to be somewhat transgressive. And this transgressive nature is littered in the way that their music asks the question of how are we still in a predicament of suffering when the people that lead us promised us the literal Canaan's land. Sithole enters into a place where the politics he had to engage with artists such as Thandi Somazwai in doing the work of not only headhunting and having to sign her and essentially kind of steal her from Kalawa Jasmine on a personal capacity, to finding someone like Zulu Boy and sculpting an album with an authenticity that still kind of sets the blueprint for golden era rap in South Africa, to the act of Squatter Camp in their kind of conscious classification of going from being literal watered down versions of American tropes to being more aware of their own temporal, spatial realities as black young men in South Africa. Sipho Sithole's name seems to be lingering in some of the most poignant artistic movements we've ever had. And this is no mistake, because he is somebody who is using the power of capitalism to attempt to slowly subvert some of its limbs. Not the whole thing. I mean, that takes a deity-like power, if it'll ever happen. But in an Afro-pessimistic sense, to admit that black people are in the worst situation. And thus, how do you use the worst to navigate something workable? I mean, maybe we can't get to the best, but how do we work through it? How do we engage with this? And I think the expression of the music that has come out of native rhythms is that negotiation that speaks to the fact that, one, we tell our own stories in our own way by understanding how they fit into the global context, borrowing where we need to, but giving out where we have to. And I think these principles have been forgotten, especially the borrowing where we need to, but giving out where we have to aspect. It seems we've fallen in an age where borrowing is the norm, and many artists don't even know what the fuck they have to give out anymore. Even when we're blessed with unique sounds like Amapiano, there seems to be a liminal energy about how to really navigate this power politically. And I think now more than ever, people like Uchobe are needed, at least on a consultation level, to sculpt the politics of how artists understand their country. The irony of it is, it's kind of deliberate. Maybe the ruling party might have forgotten to continue its mandate of conscientizing the youth. Maybe it was a mistake. Or maybe they just really didn't want young people to understand that the story of South Africa's past is not the story of how Mandela set us free, but it's the story of how many people shed their blood to either end up in a socialist outcome or to try and navigate how capitalism could possibly work for black people. We ended up with capitalism, and therefore our leaders had and still have the active choice to try and make this capitalism something more than neoliberalism sucking the life out of black culture, or to just remain here. And by the state of the country, it looks like many of our so-called leaders are more than comfortable in the latter because, I mean, they fought for us. But in the figure of Sipho Sithole, I present to you a trickster figure. Somebody who is saying to us, I might not have clean hands. Because when you're in this game, it's impossible to have clean hands. But I use my dirt to try and excavate the soil and cultivate enough seedlings for us to have room in the geography of new possibilities. What is this geography? It's a remembrance of where we've come from. This geography is a contextualization of our errors so that we can better understand how not to repeat them. His current book, Maye, is a focus into this. It profiles the journey of the building of Johannesburg into sites of migrant labor that grew to become veritable marketplaces, with Mai being a living testament not only to South Africa's past, but to this interesting intersection of where we are going. It's more than just inyama, no putu. It is literally the lifeblood and the minerals and the soil and the attitudes that make up South African people. So the book itself is a recent aspect to this conscious, I said that word, don't like it but I said it, effort to try and leave nuggets. Ironically, you know, the migrants were miners, so to leave nuggets of gold in our heads about how to be brilliant in the most useful way. Because not all brilliance is useful to us. Some brilliance is conceited and is only there to lift itself up using us. And I think through Sipho Sithole there's a kind of brilliance that yearns for collective participation. So this video is a lot of things. It's an ode to say thank you. It's critical theory in practice, to examine the politics of art today and to use Sipho Sithole as a central figure in a lot of the good things. And I know right now a lot of people will say, let's go into the allegations of how he's fucked over so many artists. So this is the last chapter in me looking at those allegations. I'm not going to go into the stories in depth because for those that know, it's been pretty much the same story in a different version. Many of the artists that he has worked with have in the past spoken in unsavory tones about contract practices that record labels put on them. But I feel like the one thing in these stories that always lingers with a little bit of mystique that we don't question is the fact that the artists themselves do not sign these contracts in duress. And also, the artists seem to be forgetting that they're like everybody else. Like a worker in a mine or a cashier at Shoprite Checkers are capitalist labor. And I think maybe Hollywoodisms, the aesthetic of the American feel of what fame and fortune is supposed to be, has tricked many artists into thinking that there's something more than just workers. But the reality of it is otherwise. Through the mobilization of fair pay and the struggle of how much funding is given to the arts sector, artists have had to have a very rude awakening of the fact that their job is like everybody else's job. The only difference is everybody sees them doing it. And because everybody sees them doing it, it might feel like it's more important. Maybe because Jesus was on the cross for everybody to see, that's why he ended up being worshipped. But don't forget that there were two big criminals right next to him who were crucified beside him. Do we worship them too? Don't forget that crucifixion was common practice in executing everybody who acted against the state. So the cross might not be a symbol of one man. It might be a symbol of what capitalism does to all of us when we've reached the end of the mark. This is me saying celebrities act like they're Jesus on the cross, and that we should weep for them when capitalism does what it does to all of us. Whose contract is fair? And the arguments are, Sithole knew the kind of deals and the kind of terms and conditions that artists sign up to. And why didn't he say anything? Because it isn't his place. Because as I said in the beginning, as a smart capitalist, your hands are always dirty. And you can only affect the system in as much as you work with it. So who the fuck are we expecting here? Mother Teresa? Because there isn't anybody whose ethical stance does not, cannot, will not bend in order to make the most important things happen. And my argument is this. South African celebrities and artists have been terrible at handling their money. And that's another conversation because, again, it's traumatic and generational. But for the most part, the capacity of how many of them have been inserted into fame was quick, fast, extremely pressurizing on the head and the mind, and therefore left many of them disoriented in a place where they ended up being so dizzy they had to point an ultimate finger at who spun the core of their living orientation. And my argument is this. They were done wrong in the very same way that your mother, who is a domestic worker, is constantly done wrong as she takes 2 or 3 taxis to get to those mansions wherever she works, or those suburbs. They were done wrong in the very same way that the next door neighbor, who might be an electrician, who's unemployed, and does the rounds that he can when he can, the construction worker. They're done wrong in the very same way we're all done wrong. And that's exactly why we always side with their story. But the capitalists aren't boogeymen. They're people. Many of them trying to navigate this system in the most effective way possible. What I'm saying is they're not actively out to get anybody. Or at least that isn't their modus operandi. It's an occupational hazard. You've got to always look at the technique and the method of how things are being done. So ultimately, my answer to that is capitalism is what it is. But we are the ones who are actively determining what it could be. And I think Sithole has shown us many aspects of how it could be something more. How within navigating this pain, we get enough reward to feed ourselves with the energy to see the horizon of a possible post-capitalist era. I don't know. If you feel that I am sitting on the tip of Sithole's, you know what, talk to me on the comment section. If you feel a little ambivalent, and you might agree with some of what I've said, but feel like much of it is not comprehensive enough, you're probably right. There's only so much I can say within the time frame I'm given. A lot of what I do here is a way to crystallize the message in a way that gives the core structure, but enough of an edge to at least get people talking because they understand my point. So that being said, if you haven't subscribed, this is the kind of shit we talk about. And I really hope this video ends up in the ears and in the eyes of those who are actively trying to work through the questions of what art in this country is going to become. Indeed, Maya Maya as an exclamation is a crying of the situation. It's saying, my oh my. What is going on? So I leave you with that. I leave you with that sentiment to ring in your ear so that you can kind of look around you at everything from the products being sold, the club you might go to every weekend to unwind, the car you might drive, the cars you might watch being driven as you catch public transport, and to think of yourself in the middle of all of this